The heavy boots echoed through the stone corridors of a small Belgian convent in the winter of 1943. 3 SS officers, their black uniforms stark against the grey walls, were about to conduct what they called a routine inspection. But this was no routine visit. Hidden in the upstairs dormitory, 60 Jewish children sat frozen in absolute silence, their small hands clasped together, their lips moving in prayer. They were reciting the Lord's Prayer in perfect French, their young voices barely above a whisper. One mistake, one Hebrew word, one moment of panic, and they would all be loaded onto cattle cars bound for Auschwitz. Standing at the classroom door, her face calm but her heart hammering against her ribs, was Sister Marie, a Catholic nun who had turned her convent into the most dangerous hiding place in occupied Belgium. What you're about to discover is a story so audacious, so brilliantly executed, that it was buried in classified documents for decades after the war ended. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this woman, whose real name was hidden even from the children she saved, became one of the most wanted fugitives by the Gestapo, and why her method of resistance was considered so dangerous that the Catholic Church itself debated whether to sanction her actions. This is the untold story of how faith became a weapon, how prayer became camouflage, and how 62 children learned to hide their identity behind the very religion that was supposed to be their enemy. Belgium in 1943 was a nation suffocating under the iron grip of Nazi occupation. The country had fallen in just 18 days back in May of 1940, and by the time our story takes place, the German war machine had transformed this small European nation into a processing center for the final solution. Every day, trains departed from the Mechelen transit camp, packed with Jewish families being shipped east to the concentration camps. The Belgian resistance was fragmented, under-equipped and hunted relentlessly by the Gestapo and their collaborators. In this landscape of terror, convents and monasteries represented one of the last sanctuaries of relative autonomy. The Catholic Church in Belgium walked a razor's edge, officially neutral but quietly sheltering those the Nazis marked for death. Our convent, located in a rural area south of Brussels, had operated for over 200 years as a school for girls from wealthy Catholic families. The nuns taught literature, music, mathematics, and religion within walls that had witnessed centuries of European history. Life there had been predictable, ordered, governed by the ringing of bells that marked prayers 7 times a day. The children who attended were daughters of Belgian aristocrats and merchant families, their futures mapped out in terms of good marriages and social standing. The war had changed enrollment dramatically, but the rhythm of convent life continued with an almost defiant normalcy. Sister Marie had joined the order in 1936 at the age of 24, driven by a calling she described as absolute and unshakable. She came from a middle-class family in Liège, the daughter of a pharmacist who had raised her to believe in service above self. Her fellow nuns described her as unremarkable in those early years, devoted but not exceptional, someone who followed the rules with precision and taught her classes with quiet competence. She had dark hair, sharp eyes, and a face that could shift from warmth to severity in an instant, a useful trait for managing classrooms of restless girls. Nothing in her background suggested she would become what the resistance later called the most valuable operative in the Catholic network. She had no military training, no experience with deception, no connections to underground movements. She was simply a nun who taught French literature and believed with every fiber of her being that children were sacred. The transformation began in the summer of 1942, when the deportations from Belgium accelerated to industrial scale. Sister Marie watched from the convent windows as trucks rolled through nearby villages, rounding up Jewish families with brutal efficiency. She heard the stories from parishioners who whispered about neighbors disappearing in the night, about children torn from their parents at train stations, about the transit camp where families were held before being shipped to the east. The official church position was caution, avoid provoking the occupiers, maintain the institution's safety so it could survive the war intact. But Sister Marie made a decision that would define the rest of her life and seal the fate of dozens of children. She approached the Mother Superior with a proposal so dangerous, so legally and morally complex, that it took 3 days of prayer and debate before approval was granted. The plan was devastatingly simple in concept, but terrifyingly difficult in execution. The convent would begin accepting Jewish children, but these children would not hide in attics or cellars like refugees in other resistance operations. They would hide in plain sight, attending classes alongside Catholic students, sleeping in the dormitories, eating in the refectory, and most dangerously participating in daily prayers and religious instruction. To the outside world, to the German patrols that occasionally passed by, to the Belgian collaborators who might inform on suspicious activity, these children would appear to be Catholic orphans displaced by the war. The first child arrived on a rainy September night in 1942, a 6-year-old girl named Sarah, whose parents had been arrested 2 days earlier. Sister Marie held the terrified child and made a promise that would become her mission statement for the next 3 years. She would teach this girl, and every child who came after her, to pray like a Catholic, to recite scripture like a believer, and to survive. The network grew with shocking speed. Within 2 months of Sarah's arrival, Sister Marie had accepted 14 more children, each one smuggled into the convent through different routes coordinated by the Belgian resistance. They came from Brussels, from Antwerp, from small villages where entire Jewish communities had been liquidated in single-day operations. Some arrived with parents who kissed them goodbye at the convent gate, knowing they might never see their children again. Others came alone, carried by resistance fighters who had found them hiding in basements or barns after their families had been deported. Each child represented an exponential increase in risk, not just for Sister Marie, but for every nun in the convent, every Catholic student who might accidentally reveal the secret, every cook and gardener who worked within those walls. The penalty for hiding Jews was immediate execution, and the Nazis had made examples of entire convents in Poland and France, burning them to the ground with everyone inside. Sister Marie understood that camouflage required more than just physical disguise. These children needed to become Catholic, not just in appearance but in reflexive behavior, in the automatic responses that would survive even under the pressure of a Gestapo interrogation. She developed a training system that was equal parts educational curriculum and survival protocol. Every morning before dawn, while the Catholic students still slept, Sister Marie gathered the Jewish children in a small chapel and began their lessons. They learned the Lord's Prayer first, repeating it until the French words flowed as naturally as breathing. Then came the Hail Mary, the Apostles' Creed, the responses required during Mass, the names of saints, the order of Catholic holidays, the proper way to make the sign of the cross. She taught them the stories of Jesus, the parables, the miracles, all the catechism that a Catholic child their age would know without thinking. The sessions lasted 2 hours every single day, with Sister Marie correcting pronunciation, testing memory, and drilling them until tears of frustration ran down young faces. But the religious training was only the foundation. Sister Marie had to erase their pasts and construct new identities that would withstand scrutiny. She created false baptismal certificates, forged documents that listed Catholic parents who had supposedly died in bombing raids or industrial accidents, invented hometowns in parts of Belgium the Germans had heavily damaged, where records had been destroyed. Each child received a new name, carefully chosen to sound Belgian and unremarkable. Sarah became Marie-Claire, Jacob became Henri, Rachel became Genevieve. Sister Marie made them practice their new names obsessively, responding instantly when called, writing their false identities in school assignments, never hesitating even for a fraction of a second. She knew that a single moment of confusion, one child who turned when their real name was called, could doom them all. The children slept in the same dormitories as the Catholic students, ate at the same tables, attended the same classes in mathematics and literature, and learned to bury their true selves so deep that even they sometimes forgot who they had been. The system worked with terrifying efficiency for almost 6 months. The convent passed 2 inspections by local Belgian police without incident, the officers accepting the story of war orphans without serious investigation. Sister Marie began to believe that they might actually survive the occupation, that she could keep these children safe until the Allies liberated Belgium. But in March of 1943, everything changed. A priest from a neighboring parish, known for his sympathies with the Nazi regime, began asking questions about the unusual number of new students at the convent. He appeared unannounced one Sunday, observing the children during Mass, watching them too carefully, noting which ones seemed less familiar with the rituals. 2 weeks later, the convent received official notice that the SS would conduct a comprehensive inspection in 72 hours, specifically to verify the backgrounds of all students currently enrolled. Sister Marie had 3 days to prepare 62 children for the performance of their lives. She gathered them that night after the Catholic students had gone to sleep and explained the reality they faced with brutal honesty. The SS officers who were coming were not ordinary police. They were trained to detect lies, to spot inconsistencies, to identify Jewish children even when those children had been coached. These men had sent thousands to the gas chambers and would feel no hesitation about adding 62 more to that count. Sister Marie told the children that they would be tested, questioned, possibly separated and interrogated individually. Their survival depended on absolute perfection, on becoming so thoroughly Catholic in that moment that even they believed it. For the next 72 hours, the convent transformed into a training camp where prayer became rehearsal and faith became armor. The preparation became a relentless cycle of rehearsal that consumed every waking moment of those 72 hours. Sister Marie divided the children into groups based on age and assigned each group specific sections of Catholic ritual they needed to master flawlessly. The youngest children, ages 5 through 8, focused exclusively on the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary, repeating them hundreds of times until the words became muscle memory, until they could recite them even when woken suddenly from sleep. The older children, ages 9 through 14, received more complex assignments. They had to memorize the entire order of the Mass, know when to stand and kneel and sit, understand the meaning of Latin phrases the priest would speak, recognize the names of all 12 apostles, and explain the significance of Easter and Christmas with the casual confidence of children who had celebrated these holidays their entire lives. Sister Marie walked among them during these sessions, firing questions without warning, creating deliberate confusion, adding pressure to simulate the fear they would feel when the SS officers arrived. She made them cry, made them stumble over words, then made them start again until they could perform even through tears. But Sister Marie knew that religious knowledge alone would not be enough to fool trained SS investigators. She had to address the physical details that could betray a child's true identity in an instant. 8 of the boys in the convent had been circumcised, a practice that was virtually universal among Jewish families, but extremely rare among Belgian Catholics of that era. This single fact represented a death sentence if discovered during any kind of physical examination. Sister Marie consulted with a resistance doctor who operated secretly in Brussels, and together they developed a cover story. These boys would be identified as having required medical procedures for infections, documented with forged hospital records that Sister Marie had a contact produce overnight. She drilled the boys on the story, made them repeat the name of the fictional doctor who had performed the procedure, the hospital where it supposedly happened, the exact date and reason. She warned them that if questioned about this, they must answer with absolute conviction. No hesitation, no shame, just a simple medical fact about their childhood. The convent itself required transformation to withstand close inspection. Sister Marie organized the older Catholic students and the nuns into teams that swept through every room, every closet, every drawer, searching for anything that could reveal the presence of Jewish children. They found and destroyed photographs that parents had hidden in their children's clothing, small mezuzahs that had been sewn into jacket linings, Hebrew prayer books buried under mattresses, stars of David worn on chains around necks. Each discovery represented a child who had been unable to fully let go of their identity, who had clung to some small piece of who they really were, and each item had to be eliminated because any one of them could trigger an investigation that would unravel everything. Sister Marie burned these items in the convent's furnace while the children watched, and she saw in their faces the final death of their former lives. She hated herself for it, hated that she was forcing these children to erase their heritage, but she also knew that heritage meant nothing if they were dead. The psychological preparation proved even more challenging than the religious training. Sister Marie had to prepare the children for interrogation techniques the SS commonly employed, methods designed to break through carefully constructed lies. She warned them that the officers might separate them from the group, take them to isolated rooms, use raised voices and intimidation to provoke panic. They might ask the same question multiple times in different ways, looking for inconsistencies in the answers. They might claim to already know the truth and offer leniency in exchange for confession. Sister Marie coached the children on a simple principle that became their mantra. Tell the same story every single time, never elaborate beyond what was asked, show no fear even when terrified, and above all, believe absolutely in the moment that they were Catholic children who belonged in this convent. She made them practice maintaining eye contact, keeping their voices steady, not fidgeting or displaying nervous behaviors that investigators were trained to recognize as signs of deception. On the final night before the inspection, Sister Marie gathered all 62 children in the chapel for what she called their last rehearsal. She had arranged for 3 resistance members, men who had experience with Nazi interrogation methods, to play the role of SS officers. These men stormed into the chapel without warning, shouting in German, demanding papers, separating children from the group, firing questions in harsh voices designed to simulate the terror of the real event. Several children broke down completely, crying and forgetting their lines, reverting to their real names in moments of panic. Sister Marie watched these failures with cold assessment, then spent the remaining hours before dawn working individually with each child who had stumbled. She held their hands, looked into their frightened eyes and told them the truth that would either save them or condemn them all. Tomorrow, when the SS walked through that door, they would not be pretending to be Catholic. They would be Catholic because anything less than total conviction would be detected, and detection meant death. The 3 SS officers arrived precisely at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning in late March, their black Mercedes sedan crunching over the gravel driveway with mechanical precision. Sister Marie watched from the second-floor window as they emerged from the vehicle. 2 men in their 30s and 1 older officer who appeared to be in command, all wearing the death's head insignia of the SS on their caps and the lightning bolt runes on their collars. They carried clipboards and leather briefcases, the bureaucratic tools of the final solution, instruments that had condemned hundreds of thousands to the gas chambers through nothing more than check marks and signatures. The Mother Superior greeted them at the main entrance with practiced cordiality, her face betraying none of the terror that gripped every person in the building. The lead officer introduced himself as Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber, a captain who explained in fluent French that this inspection was part of a comprehensive review of all educational institutions in occupied Belgium to ensure compliance with racial purity laws and to verify that no undesirables were being sheltered under false pretenses. His voice was cold, professional, and carried the implicit threat that came with absolute power over life and death. Sister Marie descended the stairs and joined the Mother Superior in the entrance hall, her hands folded calmly in front of her habit, her face composed into an expression of mild curiosity, mixed with the slight annoyance of an educator whose routine was being disrupted. She had rehearsed this performance in front of a mirror for 3 days, practicing the exact degree of cooperation that would appear helpful without seeming nervous, the kind of mundane, bureaucratic interaction that happened in occupied territories every day. Hauptsturmführer Weber explained that they would need to see all student records, interview a selection of children, observe classroom activities, and inspect the dormitories and living facilities. He emphasized that this was not an accusation, but rather a procedural requirement, though his eyes remained flat and emotionless as he spoke, scanning the hallway with the trained awareness of a predator detecting weakness. Sister Marie responded that the convent had nothing to hide, that all their students were properly documented, and that the officers were welcome to examine anything they wished. She led them first to the administrative office where student files were maintained, buying precious minutes for the children upstairs to assume their positions in the classroom where they would be observed. The younger officer, who introduced himself as Unterscharführer Schmidt, began methodically reviewing the files while Hauptsturmführer Weber watched Sister Marie with unsettling intensity. He asked about the increase in enrollment over the past year, noting that the convent had accepted 47 new students since September of 1942, an unusually high number for a rural institution. Sister Marie explained without hesitation that the war had created numerous orphans, that families displaced by bombing raids in industrial cities had sought refuge for their children in quieter locations, and that the church had a duty to provide sanctuary for innocent souls during such difficult times. Her answer was perfectly reasonable, completely consistent with the reality of occupied Belgium, and delivered with the tired resignation of someone who had answered similar questions from various authorities multiple times before. Weber nodded slowly, made a notation on his clipboard, then announced that he wanted to observe the children during their morning religious instruction, specifically to see how well the newer students had integrated into the convent's Catholic educational program. The walk from the administrative office to the classroom took less than 2 minutes, but Sister Marie experienced it as an endless corridor where every step brought them closer to exposure or salvation. She could hear her heart hammering in her chest, but kept her breathing steady, her pace measured, her expression neutral. The classroom door was closed, and from behind it came the sound of children's voices reciting in unison, a prayer session that Sister Marie had deliberately scheduled to coincide with the inspection. She paused with her hand on the door handle and offered a silent prayer of her own. Not the rehearsed Catholic prayers she had drilled into the children, but a desperate plea to whatever force governed the universe that these children would remember everything, that they would perform flawlessly, that their young lives would not end in cattle cars and gas chambers because of a forgotten word or a moment of panic. She turned the handle and opened the door to reveal 62 children sitting in neat rows, their hands folded on their desks, their voices rising in perfect unison as they recited the Lord's Prayer in French. Hauptsturmführer Weber stepped into the classroom, and the children continued praying without pause, without even glancing at the SS officers who now stood at the back of the room. Sister Marie moved to the front of the class and allowed the prayer to conclude naturally, before instructing the children to be seated. She introduced the officers as important visitors who were interested in observing the quality of Catholic education at the convent, and asked the students to demonstrate their knowledge and devotion. Weber's eyes moved slowly across the rows of young faces, studying each child with the clinical detachment of someone trained to detect racial characteristics, searching for the specific features that Nazi racial theory claimed identified Jewish bloodlines. He walked between the desks, occasionally stopping to look more closely at a particular child, his presence creating a suffocating tension that Sister Marie could feel pressing against her lungs like a physical weight. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, and asked Sister Marie to select several students at random to demonstrate their understanding of Catholic doctrine through individual recitation and questioning. Sister Marie's mind calculated probabilities in the fraction of a second before she responded to Weber's demand. She could not appear to be protecting any particular children by avoiding them, but she also could not risk selecting the weakest performers, the youngest ones who might crumble under direct questioning. She chose a middle path, pointing to Marie-Claire, the girl who had been Sarah, now 10 years old and one of the first children to arrive at the convent. Marie-Claire stood without hesitation, walked to the front of the classroom with steady steps, and positioned herself facing the SS officers with her hands clasped in front of her, exactly as Sister Marie had trained her to do. Hauptsturmführer Weber studied the girl for a long moment, then asked her to recite the Apostles' Creed from memory. Marie-Claire began immediately, her voice clear and unwavering, speaking the words with the unconscious rhythm of someone who had repeated them 1,000 times. She made no mistakes, showed no fear, and when she finished, Weber asked her to explain the meaning of the Holy Trinity. The girl answered with perfect catechism, describing the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in language that could have come from any Catholic child in Belgium, and Weber dismissed her back to her seat with a curt nod. The second child Weber selected himself, pointing to a boy in the third row named Henri, who had been Jacob before Sister Marie erased his past. Henri was 12 years old, one of the 8 circumcised boys, and his selection sent a spike of adrenaline through Sister Marie's body that she had to consciously suppress from showing on her face. Henri approached the front of the classroom with the same trained composure as Marie-Claire, but Sister Marie noticed the slight tremor in his hands that he quickly controlled by clasping them together. Weber asked him about his family background, where he had lived before coming to the convent, and the circumstances of his parents' deaths. Henri delivered the fabricated story without hesitation, explaining that his mother and father had died in a factory explosion in Charleroi 18 months earlier, that he had no other living relatives, and that the church had taken him in as an act of Christian charity. Weber pressed for details, asking the name of the factory, the date of the explosion, whether Henri remembered the funeral. The boy answered each question smoothly, referencing the false document Sister Marie had created, describing a fictional funeral mass with details he had memorized from the cover story, never wavering or showing uncertainty. But then, Weber shifted tactics with the predatory instinct of an experienced interrogator. He asked Henri if he had been baptized, and if so, where and when. The question was designed to create pressure because baptismal records could theoretically be verified, though in practice the chaos of war had destroyed many such records across Belgium. Henri responded that he had been baptized as an infant at St. Joseph's Church in Charleroi, a church that Sister Marie had specifically chosen for the false backstory because it had been severely damaged in a bombing raid and its records were incomplete. Weber made a note on his clipboard, then asked Henri to demonstrate how to properly make the sign of the cross. The boy raised his right hand and performed the gesture with practiced precision, touching his forehead, chest, left shoulder, then right shoulder, exactly as Catholics did it, nothing like the right-to-left motion that Orthodox Christians used. Weber watched every movement, then asked one final question that made Sister Marie's blood freeze. He wanted to know if Henri had any identifying marks on his body, scars or birthmarks, that would be recorded in medical files if they needed to verify his identity through hospital records. Henri responded without the slightest pause that he had a small scar on his left knee from falling off a bicycle when he was 7 years old, and a birthmark on his right shoulder blade. Both statements were lies, but they were the kind of minor physical details that normal children would know about themselves, unremarkable and unverifiable, without a physical examination that Weber showed no interest in conducting at that moment. The officer dismissed Henri back to his seat and selected 2 more children, both girls who had been in the convent long enough to perform their Catholic identities with flawless conviction. Each child answered questions about prayers, saints, religious holidays and personal histories with the same rehearsed perfection, and with each successful performance, Sister Marie felt the probability of survival incrementally increase. But she also knew that Weber was watching her, as much as he was watching the children, searching for any sign that she was coaching them with subtle signals or displaying the nervous energy of someone hiding a terrible secret. After the 4th child had been questioned and dismissed, Hauptsturmführer Weber announced that he was satisfied with the religious instruction but wanted to observe the children during their lunch period to see how they interacted in a less structured environment. He explained that this was where the truth often revealed itself, in casual moments when people forgot to maintain their performances, when natural behaviors emerged that training could not fully suppress. Sister Marie agreed with apparent indifference, though she understood that this represented a new and potentially catastrophic level of risk. The lunchtime observation would last at least 45 minutes, during which 62 children would need to maintain their false identities while eating, talking, playing, and existing in front of 3 SS officers who were trained to detect exactly the kind of deception that their lives depended upon. As the children filed out of the classroom toward the refectory, Sister Marie walked beside them, and in her mind she recited the prayer she had taught them, asking for a miracle that would carry them through the next hour without a single child breaking character and condemning them all to death. The refectory was a long stone room with high windows that let in pale March sunlight, lined with wooden tables where the children sat in assigned groups that mixed the Jewish children with their Catholic classmates in carefully calculated ratios. Sister Marie had designed this seating arrangement months earlier, specifically to prevent the formation of distinct clusters that might appear suspicious to outside observers, ensuring that every table contained a mixture of students who could monitor and support each other through casual interaction. The kitchen staff served the midday meal of vegetable soup, dark bread and weak tea, the standard wartime ration that kept hunger at bay without providing real nourishment, and the children began eating with the subdued behavior that hunger and fear produced in equal measure. Hauptsturmführer Weber and his 2 subordinates positioned themselves at different points around the room, creating overlapping fields of observation that made it impossible for any child to escape scrutiny. Weber himself stood near the center of the refectory, his arms crossed, his eyes moving constantly from table to table, watching for the small behavioral anomalies that his training had taught him to recognize as indicators of deception. The first 20 minutes passed without incident, the children eating in relative silence, occasionally whispering to their neighbors about mundane topics that Sister Marie and the other nuns had coached them to discuss if questioned. Then a moment of crisis erupted at table 4, when one of the younger boys, a 7-year-old named Thomas who had been Abraham, accidentally knocked over his cup of tea, sending liquid spreading across the wooden surface toward the girl sitting next to him. The girl reacted with instinctive speed, using a Yiddish exclamation of surprise that lasted less than a second before she caught herself and switched to French, but that single syllable hung in the air like a gunshot. Unterscharführer Schmidt, who had been standing near that table, turned sharply toward the sound, his eyes narrowing as he processed what he had heard. Sister Marie moved immediately, crossing the refectory with quick steps, arriving at the table before Schmidt could speak and addressing the spilled tea as a routine accident that required cleaning. She instructed Thomas to be more careful and handed the girl a cloth to wipe the table, speaking in a tone of mild irritation that suggested this was an unremarkable disruption rather than a potentially fatal revelation. Schmidt watched this interaction with obvious suspicion, then called Sister Marie aside and asked her directly if she had heard what the girl had said when the tea spilled. Sister Marie responded with perfect confusion, asking what he meant, explaining that she had only heard a startled exclamation that could have been any number of French expressions, nothing unusual for a child surprised by cold liquid. She asked Schmidt if he spoke Yiddish, if he was familiar enough with the language to distinguish it from French dialectical variations spoken in different regions of Belgium, and her question carried just enough professional challenge to make Schmidt hesitate. He was not a linguistic expert. He had heard something that sounded foreign, but he could not be certain enough to make an accusation that might prove embarrassing if Sister Marie was correct about regional French variations. He returned to his observation position without pursuing the matter further. But Sister Marie saw that his attention had sharpened, that he was now watching that particular table with increased focus, waiting for additional mistakes that would confirm his suspicion. The tension escalated 15 minutes later, when Hauptsturmführer Weber decided to interact directly with the children rather than simply observing them passively. He approached table 6 and sat down among the students, a tactical move designed to make them uncomfortable and potentially provoke unguarded reactions. He asked casual questions about their favorite subjects, their daily routines, what they did for recreation, all delivered in a conversational tone that concealed the interrogation beneath. The children at that table responded with rehearsed normalcy, mentioning mathematics and literature classes, describing games they played in the courtyard, discussing the limited entertainment available in wartime Belgium. Then Weber asked a question that Sister Marie had not prepared them for because she had not anticipated this specific line of inquiry. He wanted to know if any of them had attended Mass at churches outside the convent, if they had family members who visited them for religious holidays, if they maintained connections to parish communities beyond these walls. The question was devastating in its simplicity because it exposed a gap in the cover stories Sister Marie had constructed. These children had no families who visited, no parish connections, no history of attending Christmas Mass or Easter services anywhere except within the convent itself. Their entire Catholic identity existed only within these walls, which was suspicious for children who were supposedly baptized members of the faith, with roots in communities across Belgium. One of the older girls at the table, a 13-year-old who had been trained extensively in maintaining her cover story, provided an answer that attempted to navigate this trap. She explained that the war had disrupted normal life so completely that many families had stopped attending church regularly, that travel was difficult and dangerous, that the convent had become their entire world because the outside world had become too unstable. Her answer was plausible and matched the reality of occupied Belgium, but it also highlighted the isolation of these children in a way that made Weber's eyes sharpen with renewed interest. He thanked the girl for her honesty, stood from the table, and walked directly toward Sister Marie with an expression that indicated the inspection had entered a new and more dangerous phase. Hauptsturmführer Weber informed Sister Marie that he required a private interview with her in the Mother Superior's office, a request that carried the weight of command rather than courtesy. As they walked through the corridor away from the refectory, Sister Marie understood that the inspection had reached its critical moment, that Weber had detected enough inconsistencies or suspicious patterns to warrant deeper investigation, and that the next 30 minutes would determine whether 62 children lived or died. The office was a small room dominated by a heavy wooden desk and a crucifix on the wall, and Weber closed the door behind them with deliberate slowness before speaking. He began by complimenting the quality of religious instruction at the convent, noting that the children had demonstrated impressive knowledge of Catholic doctrine, but then his tone shifted to something harder and more accusatory. He stated that in his experience conducting inspections across occupied Belgium, he had developed an instinct for detecting anomalies, and this convent presented several anomalies that required explanation. The student population had increased by over 70% in 18 months, yet none of these new students had family members who visited or maintained contact. The children's baptismal records came from churches scattered across different regions of Belgium, with no apparent pattern or connection. Most troubling, several of the children displayed behavioral markers that his training had taught him to associate with coached responses rather than genuine knowledge. Sister Marie responded with a performance that drew on every reserve of courage and deception she possessed. She acknowledged that the situation was unusual, but insisted it was a direct consequence of the war's devastation of Belgian family structures. She explained that many of these children had lost their entire extended families in bombing raids, industrial accidents, or the chaos of military operations, leaving them with no relatives capable of providing care or maintaining contact. She reminded Weber that Belgium had been under occupation for nearly 3 years, that normal life had been suspended, that institutions like the convent were struggling to maintain basic functions while absorbing the human wreckage that war produced. Her voice carried just the right mixture of defensive pride and exhausted resignation, the tone of someone who had been working without rest to fulfill a moral obligation and now found that work being questioned by authorities who had no understanding of the practical challenges involved. She asked Weber directly if he was suggesting that the church should have turned away orphaned children, should have allowed them to starve or become street urchins, should have prioritized bureaucratic perfection over Christian charity during the worst humanitarian crisis Belgium had faced in generations. Weber's response revealed the calculating intelligence that had made him effective in his role, hunting hidden Jews across occupied Europe. He stated that he was not questioning the convent's charitable intentions, but rather its judgment in accepting children without proper verification of their backgrounds, and he noted that resistance networks were known to exploit Catholic institutions by hiding Jewish children among legitimate orphans, counting on the church's reluctance to cooperate with German authorities. He explained that his orders were to identify and remove any Jewish children being sheltered under false identities, and that failure to comply with these orders would result in the arrest of everyone involved and the closure of the institution. Then he made a demand that represented the ultimate test of Sister Marie's preparation. He wanted to conduct individual medical examinations of all male students enrolled in the past 18 months, explaining that this was standard procedure for verifying identity when documentation was questionable, and that the examinations would be performed by a German military doctor who would arrive within 2 hours. Sister Marie felt the floor seemed to drop away beneath her feet, because this was the scenario she had feared most and prepared for least effectively. The 8 circumcised boys could not survive a medical examination that specifically looked for that physical evidence of Jewish identity. The forged hospital records and rehearsed explanations about childhood infections would crumble under the scrutiny of a trained physician who conducted hundreds of such examinations and knew exactly what he was looking for. She had perhaps 90 minutes to either prevent this examination from happening or to evacuate 8 children from the convent without alerting the SS officers who were still on the premises, neither of which seemed remotely possible. She made a decision in that moment that represented either brilliant tactical thinking or complete desperation, and she told Weber that she could not allow such examinations to proceed without explicit authorization from the Archbishop of Brussels, that the Church had protocols regarding the physical examination of children in its care, and that violating those protocols would create a diplomatic incident between the German occupation authority and the Vatican that neither side wanted. Weber's face hardened into an expression of cold fury, and he informed Sister Marie that the SS did not require permission from religious authorities to enforce racial purity laws in occupied territories, that her refusal to cooperate constituted obstruction of a military investigation, and that he was now placing the entire convent under temporary detention while he contacted his superiors to determine the appropriate response. He ordered Unterscharführer Schmidt to gather all students in the main hall and to ensure that no one entered or left the building until further notice. Sister Marie watched the SS officer leave the room to execute these orders, and she understood with absolute clarity that she had perhaps 1 hour before the situation escalated beyond any possibility of control, 1 hour before a German military doctor arrived to conduct examinations that would expose the 8 boys and trigger a complete investigation that would reveal all 62 Jewish children 1 hour before everything she had built and risked and sacrificed would collapse into arrests, deportations, and death. Sister Marie returned to the main hall where Schmidt was assembling the students and found herself facing a scene of controlled chaos as over 100 children, both Catholic and Jewish, were being herded into rows while the 2 younger SS officers patrolled the perimeter. She had no weapons, no leverage, no obvious escape route, and no time to implement any kind of careful plan. What she did have was intimate knowledge of the building's architecture, relationships with every person inside those walls, and the desperate clarity that comes when all conventional options have been exhausted. She caught the eye of Sister Agnes, the oldest nun in the convent who had been teaching there for 43 years, and communicated through a subtle gesture a message they had rehearsed during the 3 days of preparation. Sister Agnes moved toward the small chapel adjacent to the main hall and began ringing the bell that normally called the community to prayer, but she rang it in an irregular pattern, 3 short rings followed by 2 long ones, repeated continuously. This was not a call to prayer, but rather an alarm signal that every nun in the convent understood as a code for immediate crisis requiring emergency protocols. The sound of the chapel bell triggered a coordinated response that Sister Marie had designed months earlier as a contingency plan for exactly this scenario. The kitchen staff, all of whom were aware of the hidden children and had participated in the conspiracy to protect them, began preparing an elaborate midday meal far beyond anything the convent's wartime rations should have allowed, using emergency food stores that had been hoarded for precisely this purpose. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread began filling the corridors, an olfactory impossibility in rationed Belgium that immediately drew the attention of the SS officers who had not eaten well themselves in weeks. Simultaneously, Sister Catherine, who managed the convent's administrative records, approached Hauptsturmführer Weber with urgent news that several filing cabinets in the records room appeared to have been disturbed, possibly by resistance operatives, and that critical documents might have been stolen during the night. This claim was completely fabricated, but it served the crucial purpose of dividing the SS officers' attention and creating multiple simultaneous concerns that prevented them from maintaining focused surveillance on the assembled children. While Weber and Schmidt investigated the supposed break-in at the records room, leaving only the 3rd officer to watch over the children in the main hall, Sister Marie implemented the most audacious element of her emergency plan. She announced to the assembled students that they would spend this detention period in communal prayer and song, demonstrating to the German authorities the depth of their Catholic faith and their devotion to God even under difficult circumstances. She led the children in a full recitation of the Rosary, all 5 decades of Hail Marys, interspersed with the Lord's Prayer and the Glory Be, a marathon of prayer that lasted nearly 40 minutes and created a hypnotic atmosphere of religious devotion that filled the hall with the sound of young voices, speaking in perfect synchronization. The 8 circumcised boys were positioned in the center of the group, surrounded by layers of other children, made invisible by the sheer density of the assembled students and the officers' reluctance to interrupt what appeared to be a genuine expression of Catholic piety. The strategy was not to hide them physically, but to camouflage them within such an overwhelming display of religious identity that questioning any individual child would seem petty and suspicious. The situation reached its breaking point when Hauptsturmführer Weber returned from investigating the records room, having found no evidence of any break-in, and announced with barely controlled anger that the German military doctor had arrived early and was waiting in the courtyard to begin examinations immediately. Sister Marie made a calculation in that instant that either represented inspired genius or suicidal recklessness, and she told Weber that before any examinations could proceed, the children deserved to know why they were being subjected to this treatment, and that she would explain to them in terms they could understand. Weber, perhaps sensing that he was close to breaking the case open, agreed to allow Sister Marie to address the students. She stood before the assembled children, looked directly at the 8 boys whose lives hung in the balance, and delivered a speech that was simultaneously a prayer, a coded message, and a desperate gamble. She told the children that some people in the world doubted their faith, doubted their devotion to Christ, doubted that they were true Catholics worthy of God's love, and that they would now have the opportunity to prove those doubters wrong through their actions and their unwavering commitment to the Church. Sister Marie then led the children in a final prayer, but this time she chose the Nicene Creed, a longer and more complex statement of Catholic faith that required nearly 5 minutes to recite in full. As the children's voices rose in unison, speaking of belief in one God, in Jesus Christ the only Son, in the Holy Spirit who gives life, Sister Marie watched Hauptsturmführer Weber's face and saw something shift in his expression. He was witnessing over 100 children reciting advanced Catholic doctrine with perfect synchronization and obvious conviction, performing at a level that would be virtually impossible to fake, and the sheer weight of this display began to undermine his suspicion. The German military doctor, standing in the doorway waiting to begin his examinations, also witnessed this performance, and when the prayer concluded, Weber turned to the doctor and engaged in a brief conversation in German that Sister Marie could not fully hear. The doctor shrugged, made a notation on his clipboard and left the building without conducting a single examination. Weber turned back to Sister Marie with an expression that mixed frustration with grudging respect, and informed her that the inspection was concluded, that the convent's documentation would be flagged for future review, but that no immediate action would be taken. The 3 SS officers departed the convent at approximately 2:30 that afternoon, their Mercedes sedan disappearing down the gravel driveway, while every person inside the building remained frozen in position, afraid to move or speak until the sound of the engine had faded completely into silence. Only then did Sister Marie allow herself to breathe fully, and only then did she see the 8 boys, who had been saved from medical examination collapse into tears of relief and terror that they had been suppressing for hours. She gathered those boys in the chapel away from the other children and held them while they sobbed, their small bodies shaking with the delayed reaction to trauma, and she whispered apologies for putting them through this ordeal, even though she knew that the alternative would have been their deaths. The other nuns moved through the building, checking on the remaining children, many of whom had also broken down emotionally now that the immediate threat had passed, and the convent spent the rest of that day in a state of shocked aftermath, processing what had nearly happened and how close they had come to complete destruction. But Sister Marie understood that surviving one inspection did not guarantee safety, and that Hauptsturmführer Weber's decision to leave without conducting examinations was based on insufficient evidence rather than genuine belief in the convent's innocence. The notation he had made about future review meant that they were now flagged in SS records as a location requiring additional scrutiny, and that another inspection could come at any time with less warning and more aggressive tactics. She spent the following weeks intensifying the children's training, adding new layers of detail to their cover stories, and developing additional contingency plans for scenarios she had not previously considered. The convent became a theater of permanent performance, where every moment was rehearsed, every interaction was calculated, and the 62 Jewish children lived in a state of constant low-level terror that occasionally spiked into acute panic when German patrols passed nearby or when rumors circulated about new SS operations targeting hidden Jews. The operation continued for another 15 months after the March inspection, during which time Sister Marie accepted 23 additional Jewish children, bringing the total number of lives being hidden within the convent to 85 by the summer of 1944. The expansion of the network was driven by the accelerating pace of deportations as the Nazis, sensing their eventual defeat, intensified efforts to complete the final solution before the war ended. Sister Marie could not turn away children who arrived at the convent gate with resistance fighters, who begged her to take just one more, to save just one more life, even though every additional child increased the mathematical probability of discovery and catastrophic failure. The convent passed 2 more SS inspections during this period, both less thorough than the March encounter with Hauptsturmführer Weber, but each one requiring the same exhausting performance, the same suppression of terror, the same desperate prayer that the deception would hold for just one more day. The liberation of Belgium began in September of 1944, when Allied forces crossed the border and began pushing German troops back toward the Rhine. Sister Marie spent those final weeks of occupation in a state of almost unbearable tension, knowing that the Nazis often executed their prisoners and destroyed evidence as they retreated, and fearing that the convent might be targeted in a final spasm of violence before the occupiers withdrew. On the morning of September 9th, American soldiers arrived at the convent, and Sister Marie met them at the gate to explain what she had been doing for the past 3 years. The soldiers initially did not believe her story because it seemed too extraordinary, too impossibly risky to be real, until she brought out the 85 Jewish children and their true identities were revealed. Many of those children had been in the convent so long, had performed their Catholic identities so thoroughly, that they struggled to remember their real names, and some of the youngest ones cried in confusion when told they were actually Jewish because they had internalized the deception so completely that it had become their reality. The immediate aftermath of liberation brought both joy and profound grief as the children learned the fates of their families. Of the 85 children Sister Marie had saved, 73 discovered that both parents had been murdered in the concentration camps. 8 found that one parent had survived, and only 4 were reunited with both mother and father who had somehow escaped the deportations. Sister Marie attended these reunions when they occurred, and she witnessed parents who did not initially recognize their own children because years of separation and trauma had transformed both the children and the adults beyond recognition. She also confronted the psychological damage her rescue operation had inflicted, the reality that she had saved these children's lives by forcing them to deny their identities, to reject their heritage, to become Catholic in ways that could never be fully undone. Some of the children harbored resentment toward her for this forced conversion, feeling that she had stolen something essential from them even while saving their lives, and Sister Marie accepted this resentment as a justified cost of the choices she had made. The liberation was not the happy ending that simplified narratives suggest, but rather a complex moment of survival mixed with loss, relief mixed with trauma, and salvation that came at a price that would take decades to fully calculate. Sister Marie's story was deliberately buried for decades after the war ended, hidden not by enemies, but by the institutions she had served. The Catholic Church, deeply uncomfortable with the theological implications of a nun who had taught Jewish children to pray as Catholics, refused to officially recognize her actions or nominate her for any honors. The Belgian government, embarrassed by the extent of collaboration with Nazi deportations, preferred to emphasize military resistance rather than civilian rescue operations that highlighted how many citizens had done nothing while their Jewish neighbors were murdered. Sister Marie herself refused interviews, destroyed most of her wartime records, and insisted that the children she saved never speak publicly about their experiences in the convent. She lived quietly until her death in 1978 at the age of 66, working as a teacher in the same convent where she had conducted her rescue operation, and when she died, her obituary mentioned nothing about the 85 lives she had saved. It was only in the 1990s, when some of the surviving children began speaking publicly as part of Holocaust testimony projects, that the full scope of her operation became known. What makes Sister Marie's story particularly significant is that it represents a form of resistance that required no weapons, no violence, no traditional heroism of the kind that gets celebrated in war monuments and history books. She defeated the SS not through combat, but through performance, turning Catholic prayer into camouflage and religious education into a survival strategy that exploited the Nazis' own ideological blind spots. Her method was so effective precisely because it seemed impossible, because no one would believe that Jewish children could be hidden by making them more visibly Catholic, by placing them in classrooms and chapels where they prayed alongside genuine believers. The 8 circumcised boys she saved, the ones who came within minutes of exposure during that March inspection, all survived to adulthood, and several became teachers themselves, passing on the lesson that identity can be both essential and flexible, that survival sometimes requires becoming someone else without losing who you truly are. The reason you have never heard this story before, the reason it does not appear in standard World War II narratives or Holocaust education curricula, is that it challenges comfortable assumptions about resistance, about religious identity, and about the costs of survival. Sister Marie forced children to deny their Judaism and embrace Catholicism, which some scholars argue constitutes a form of cultural genocide even when done to save lives. Other scholars counter that she gave those children the only chance they had to survive, and that judging her methods from the safety of peacetime represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the moral calculus that existed under Nazi occupation. What cannot be disputed is that 85 human beings who would have been murdered in gas chambers lived because one nun decided that breaking rules, risking everything, and teaching the Lord's Prayer to Jewish children was less sinful than watching them die. That is the story they did not want you to know. The story of how faith became a weapon, how prayer became armor, and how one woman's courage created a miracle disguised as education.